Vamos a iniciar la charla inaugural de las carreras de enseñanza del inglés, primaria con concentración en inglés y preescolar con concentración en inglés. El día de hoy vamos a tener unas palabras de los directores, de la directora del Departamento de Educación, el director del Departamento de Filosofía, Artes y Letras y la doctora Milagro Piñeiro en representación del director de la sede Occidente. Entonces vamos a iniciar con la doctora Mirinet Rodríguez primero, en nombre del Departamento de Educación. El director del Departamento de Filosofía, Artes y Letras y la doctora Milagro Piñeiro en representación del director de la sede Occidente. Entonces vamos a iniciar con la doctora Mirinet Rodríguez.
Hola, buenos días, ¿me escuchan?
En nombre del Departamento de Educación.
Bueno, muy buenos días. Tenga la representante de la dirección de esta hermosa sede de Occidente, Milagro Piñeiro, al director del FAL, Henry Vargas. Buenos días a la directora del CIDICER, Luz Marina, muy buenos días.
Bueno, muy buenos días.
Al coordinador de lenguas modernas,
de la dirección de
José Miguel, muy buenos días.
Y
a la coordinadora encargada de asuntos internacionales, pues muchas gracias por organizar esta actividad junto con el coordinador. Y al invitado, por supuesto, bienvenido, ¿verdad? Es un honor tenerlo acá con nosotros. Muchas gracias. Bueno, y al cuerpo docente y a los estudiantes, muy buenos días, sean bienvenidos y bienvenidas a esta hermosa actividad que organiza el FAL. Creo yo que la dirección del Departamento de Educación junto con el FAL hacen esfuerzos enormes por hacer este tipo de actividades. Para mí es un honor estar aquí acompañándolos en tan relevante charla, la cual nos invita a volver nuestra mirada a los procesos de admisión y de ingreso de cada uno de ustedes y de los que vienen, y a reconocer que hemos tenido avances importantes en este trayecto educativo, pero sin duda alguna necesitamos fortalecer las redes interinstitucionales, tanto nacionales como internacionales, para comprender que existen buenas prácticas en estos procesos y que por eso está nuestro invitado acá, el doctor Marley Shirley, que él nos viene a mostrar sus aportes en esta temática, que estos van a ser clave para una organización estratégica de la universidad y, por supuesto, del departamento. Felicitar al estudiantado que se encuentra hoy acá y darles una cordial y grata bienvenida y decirles que estamos aquí para acompañarles en este proceso de formación que realiza la universidad. Quedamos atentos a las palabras del doctor Maurice, a su voz y a sus orientaciones. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a la doctora Mirinet, directora del Departamento de Educación. Vamos a darle la palabra a continuación al doctor Henry Vargas, director del Departamento de Filosofía, Artes y Letras, quien también nos va a dar una bienvenida a la actividad y unas palabras.
Muy buenos días. Primero voy a saludar al invitado especial, doctor Marley Shirley, bienvenido a la sede de Occidente de la Universidad de Costa Rica, de la Universidad de Indiana. Doctora Milagro Piñeiro, en representación del señor director de la sede de Occidente, don Maynor Badilla. Doctora Luz Marina Vázquez, directora del CIDICER. Doctora Mirinet Rodríguez, directora del Departamento de Educación. profesor José Miguel Vargas, profesora Carolina Álvarez, y también agradecer a los profesores, todas las personas estudiantes que se encuentran en este auditorio y al personal administrativo que también gracias a ellos estamos transmitiendo esta presentación. Así que un agradecimiento sincero a cada una y a cada uno de ustedes. Hoy 21 de marzo, entre tantas fechas que se celebran en el mundo, no sé si alguien recordó, pero hoy es un día también muy especial porque se celebra el Día Mundial del Síndrome de Down. Así que no sé si alguno anda con esto de las medias. ¿Alguien las trajo? Sí, eso. Así que si me ven con una media diferente a la otra, es que hoy celebramos algo que tiene que ver con la dignidad, que tiene que ver con el respeto hacia esas personas, porque también la Universidad de Costa Rica es un lugar inclusivo, es un lugar donde admitimos a todos y a todas. También queremos agradecer al doctor Maurice por este estudio sobre los procesos de admisión. Y en estos días estuvimos conversando con él de las diferencias entre los diversos departamentos, las carreras, las coordinaciones de las carreras. Entonces ya empezamos a entablar un diálogo para que le sirva para sus estudios de doctorado, que le deseamos muchos éxitos en esos estudios de doctorado, pero también agradecer a Carolina Álvarez como coordinadora de la OAICE para que este proceso no solo sea en beneficio de la Universidad de Indiana, sino que sea paralelo, que sea en beneficio también de nuestra querida Universidad de Costa Rica. Que esto también logre entablar medidas en donde puedan realizarse intercambios. Ojalá pronto tengamos intercambios entre ambas universidades. Así que esperamos que este proceso sea paralelo entre la UCR y la UI. Así que muchas gracias, doctor Maurice, y le deseamos lo mejor. Gracias.
A continuación vamos a darle un espacio a la doctora Milagro Piñeiro, quien es representante de la dirección y nos va a dar también unas palabras.
Muy buenos días, doctor Marley Shirley, profesor de la Universidad de Indiana, Mirna Rodríguez, directora del Departamento de Educación, Henry Vargas, director del FAL, José Miguel Vargas, coordinador de la sección de Lenguas Modernas, Carolina Álvarez, encargada de la Comisión de Asuntos Internacionales, Luz Marina Vázquez, directora del CIDICET, docentes, estudiantes, administrativos y personas de la comunidad que nos acompañan. Hoy es un día muy importante, nos acompaña el doctor Marley Shirley. Les voy a hablar un poquito de él para que lo conozcan. Él es investigador de la Universidad de Indiana, Estados Unidos, como lo han mencionado los compañeros anteriores. El doctor Shirley trabaja para un programa doctoral en educación y sus investigaciones se centran, en su mayoría, en el análisis de los apoyos que reciben las personas estudiantes en el sistema educativo para acceder a la educación superior y garantizar de esta manera su permanencia en las carreras, también el liderazgo estudiantil y la diversidad educativa. El doctor Shirley también trabajó en la Universidad de Georgia e hizo estudios doctorales en educación superior y educación secundaria en la Universidad de Nueva York. Tiene también una maestría en educación superior y personal administrativo de la Universidad de Nueva York y un bachillerato en inglés y educación de la Universidad del Estado de Ohio. Hoy tenemos el gusto de tener al doctor Shirley en la sede Occidente y nos dará una conferencia denominada Retos Globales en Educación y Procesos de Admisión. Un tema que es muy importante en general para la educación superior, no solamente a nivel nacional e internacional. Esta reflexión es pertinente, pues el sistema educativo costarricense no queda fuera de los efectos de la pandemia causada por el COVID-19. Adicionalmente, ya se venía enfrentando retos relacionados con la inclusión educativa, la transición de las metodologías de enseñanza, la accesibilidad del Internet, procesos sociales y recortes presupuestarios. En nombre de la dirección de la sede, le damos la bienvenida al Dr. Shirley. In behalf of our University of Costa Rica, we want to welcome you, Dr. Shirley, and we hope you have the most pleasant time in our university. Gracias.
Welcome, Dr. Shirley. We're ready for your presentation.
Good morning, everyone. How are you? We're good, we're fine. All right, it's great to see you all. I would like to say thank you for welcoming to your campus and your beautiful country. I will also say thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to get to learn more about me, my work, but also sharing your lives and your experiences with me. As part of this endeavor, I like to think of it as a conversation and a collaboration between two countries, two institutions where we have a lot to learn from one another. Even as we start thinking about what does it mean to be a global society and a global community, we have much to talk about in terms of the challenges that we are facing. Although we are talking about challenges today, I do like to let people know there are a lot of beautiful things happening in education. A lot of progress, a lot of innovation is happening, but we still have to focus on where can we do better, who can we support, and who we can think about the most as our global context change and evolve over time. With that being said, I would like to start my presentation talking about some of those challenges and what brought me to this work. Originally, I was a student. I was poor when I grew up in the United States. I am the first person to go to college in my family. Are there any other individuals who are the first to go to college in their families? Okay, very nice. Good for you for making it here. For those who have had others lead the way for them, even better. It makes it slightly easier, but it's still a challenge, right, to get into college, to do well and succeed. So congratulations to you all for being here as well. In my family, as the first person who's gone to college, I had a lot of pressure placed on me, and it still sits on me even though I finished college. So I always like to think about those populations where you may be the first, or even if you're not the first, you may be low income where you may not be able to afford college or may need some type of help or assistance, and that could be financial, it could be mentally, it could be physically. There are all different types of support. So that's what some of this work is leading me to in terms of the research that I do. Now, on a comparative scale, I spoke a little bit about how we have a lot to learn in conversations and collaborations, but on a comparative approach, I find that the work that I do in the United States is very important, but it's also very one-sided. And the United States has a lot to learn from other countries who think differently and outside the box. So what I want to do today is share what we have learned in the United States from other countries, such as Brazil, India, South Africa, and then also Germany and Italy. I won't go through all those countries, but I will include them as examples throughout the talk. So that way I can kind of share what I have learned in my global travels over the last 15 years. Okay, without further ado, I would like to start by talking about equity. What we are facing in higher education on a global context are issues of equity. And we often have to stop and think about equity for whom? Who are we concerned about the most? Who deserves attention? Who have been historically or traditionally marginalized or excluded from education or social circles or mobility? We also think about on which metrics. Are we talking about race? Are we talking about income? Are we talking about socioeconomic status, which is a combination of factors of education, income, parental education? So we have to think about how are we going to understand equity before we start talking about what do we do about equity. Equity can mean a lot of things for different individuals, and that's also another challenge, is that there are many definitions about equity. But what I like to think about of equity is giving people a fair shot, not always an equal shot. Equal does not always get us there. When we say, I get one, you get one, it doesn't mean that you only need one. I may need one, but you may need two of something. So when we're talking about equity, it's talking about being fair and representative of what individuals need. And that's the working definition that I like to utilize when we're talking about equity. It's not just being equal, it's about understanding individuals' needs and providing them with those, or addressing those needs and providing them with the services and resources and supports that are directly addressed to those needs. I also like to ask individuals and think about how much equity is enough equity. When have we decided we have made it there? When do we decide we've had enough, we have achieved a goal? And that is a harder question that I can give you an answer to, but I also challenge everyone else to think about how much equity is enough. I don't think we will ever achieve equity. As we continue to think about competition, evolution of needs, equity is something that we will constantly have to work on and evaluate and fluctuate, especially as demographics shift. I like to think that we think of white people in America being the majority, but when we think on a global context, they are not the majority. So as demographics shift, equity has to be reevaluated to make sure that the global majority has been served, has been catered to, has been addressed in terms of needs and supports. And so when we're thinking about equity, a lot of my conversation around challenges when an admissions process will target equitable issues of saying we have processes in place, but people experience them differently due to equitable or inequities in our societies around the world. I also like to press upon, why do we talk about the need of equity? So we often think that individuals who make it into certain spaces or places are the best and brightest, and they are among the best and brightest. But I often like to say, and this has been spread throughout our society, is that talent is distributed equitably and evenly throughout our world, but opportunities are not. Meaning, we can find the best singers, the best dancers, the most thought-provoking intellectuals in all aspects, whether they are rich, poor, black, white, Latino, male, female, young, old. We can find talent in every part of our society, but where the opportunities are not equitably distributed. They're mostly put in places or provided to individuals who are more privileged. So when we're thinking about talent, I like to think, and let individuals know that talent, it can be found anywhere. We have to go out and seek it. It's not that people are not there, it's that equity has to go out and be willing to find those individuals and provide them with services and resources to showcase that talent in spaces and environments that help them thrive and succeed. As I also mentioned, equality is not enough. Giving one person one or giving everyone the equal amounts may not be the solution to what we are facing. We've tried that before throughout the world when it comes to income taxes, when it comes to scholarships of giving flat fees. It doesn't work on a larger scale because different people are starting at different vantage points. So we have to start thinking about equity instead of equality. And then also we have to think about our historical context. Equity also addressed the historical representations that have happened over decades, if not centuries. Those who have been disadvantaged, they were not disadvantaged at birth just by being born. They had parents, they had grandparents probably, they had ancestors who started or were placed in systems of oppression or systems that did not advantage them that started this process. So when we start thinking about equity, we're not only correcting our lives right now and our lived experiences, but we also have ground to make up in terms of how our ancestors and our families were presented and treated in years before we even arrived here. So when we think about equity, we're addressing those issues, but also setting a foundation for hopefully our children, our grandchildren, even if we decide we're not gonna have children or grandchildren, other people's children and grandchildren, right? It's not so much talking about our families, but what is happening around society and the betterment of others. So, out of all the challenges that I've seen in my conversations in the United States, here in Costa Rica, even though I've only been with you all for now one whole day, and also my travels in Germany, Brazil, over the last 15 years, I have seen, I would say, over hundreds of challenges that people have presented. I spoke with one of your representatives, Joanna, yesterday, and I asked her one big challenge facing her work. She's like, oh, I have a lot of challenges I could talk to you about, as we all may be able to pick some out ourselves. Out of those, I have picked 8. I will not talk about all 8. We don't really have time to talk about all 8. I will highlight 4 of these. But the 8 that I really kind of boiled it down to in my observations, my conversations, and my research are talking about preparedness. So when we're thinking about admissions and getting access to higher education, how are people getting prepared? How are schools, in terms of high schools, early elementary or early childhood education, how are we starting to prepare individuals academically, socially, mentally, developmentally, to be ready for for college or higher education? The second one is finances and affordability. Colleges are expensive these days. As we have seen throughout the world, it gets more expensive for individuals, and it goes to the fact that we need more. We have more technological advances, so that requires computers, it requires nice classrooms that needs to be improved and maintained. It requires money to allow individuals to do telecommunications as we're doing right now. But all of that typically stems from the government either investing in education or divesting in terms of taking money away from the budget. And when that happens, students and families are often placed at disadvantages of figuring out how do they pay for college if the government or the university is unable to subsidize their education. The third challenge is the population growth and demand. Our global population is growing by 1% every single year. Roughly, that's 87 million people a year. So as we think about more people being born and as our population grows, we have to think about how many people are eligible to attend college. That could range anywhere from the ages of 15 all the way up to ages of 90, and even in some cases, ages of 100. We've seen individuals going back to school to get their higher education credentials. The fourth one is geography and technology. I won't spend too much time on it, but talking about how do we bridge geographical barriers and stop being so insular or siloed. For the past few decades, we've been able to say what happens in our country, that's all we need to know, or that's the benefit. But as we have learned, especially through the pandemic with global communications and conferencing, we have more issues and more challenges in terms of how do we break down those geographical, physical boundaries and make them a little bit more invisible. How do we reach out to people around the world? How do we learn from people around the world? How do we invite them into our conversations and have reciprocity? And then the last one, or the next one we have is standardized testing. It's talking about admissions testing practices, and I'll go into more detail throughout the slides there. Also tracking systems, how do we keep track of all of our students throughout the process without having one student fall through the cracks? We often like to think that if 90% of students make it, we've done a great job, but what about those 10% that have been forgotten? Even if it's 1%, that 1% could represent millions of individuals. Are we okay with letting those million individuals slip through the cracks? I would say no, but I always challenge individuals to kind of think about that from their own perspectives. The other one, the next one is shifting values on education. This is really happening in the United States more so than other countries that I've seen, where individuals who have been highly educated, went to some of the best universities, are now challenging, should people go to college? Is it worth it? Should we continue providing opportunities and access for college? Should we continue to fund college or higher education? Those are fair questions. Those are very fair concerns. But it's also a dangerous road when we start saying higher education is no longer needed, especially when we know things are becoming more advanced, more automated, and more systemically or technologically advanced. And what we also are seeing with the challenges on the values is that those individuals who challenge higher education, they still send their children to college, but they are now discouraging other individuals who they feel do not belong, who they feel should not be educated. They are trying to discourage them from going to college to make more space for the privileged individuals, which is a concern we have to think about. And then last but definitely not least is college choice and reliable information. Students have many choices when going to college. The first is being, do I go or do I not go? If I decide to go, where do I go? And if I want to go to a particular university, how do I get there? There are many choices that have to be made. Oftentimes, students do not have the information to do so, and we have to talk about that. So without further ado, I'll jump into the top four that I would like to elaborate on. So the first one is finances and affordability. As I mentioned, many nations are divesting from higher education, meaning they are finding themselves in financial situations where when they have to look at their overall budgets, education tends to be the first department or the first kind of bucket or area that gets money removed. So for example, when it came to the pandemic in many countries, we invested in education by providing some Zoom, but we also removed many things such as scholarships, living stipends, because we felt that individuals were working and living from home around the world. So why do we need to provide them with a living stipend if they're not living on college campuses or living closer to college campuses? This happened in the United States. It happened in Germany. It also happened in some parts of India. And we also saw China having some similar processes of taking back money from education, because when you have a finite amount of money, you often say, we have bigger issues. That case being the pandemic. How do we get vaccines out? How do we protect our borders? How do we protect individuals? So money was taken from education across the world in various countries to say we need to focus on other priorities at this point in time. Education was still going in terms of higher education, but people were not able to afford education. So what we have seen in many countries around the world are what we call enrollment cliffs, where enrollment was moving up in terms of more students enrolling, and then when the pandemic happened, people had questions, people could not afford it, and now we see enrollments dropping. We're not sure if that will rebound, but many of it will be discovered or uncovered in the next 5 to 10 years, we believe. But in terms of finances and affordability, we have to think about who can afford college, because the college tuition prices are not going down across the world. They may remain stagnant or they will continue to increase, but they will not decline, unfortunately. And that's something we have to think about. So if we talk about everything people have to pay for, exams, living, textbooks, transportation to school, clothing, right? Any other types of opportunities that require some type of financial support or financial contributions from students and their families, we have to stop and think about how much can people afford. And in an equitable manner, if I can afford 10%, that doesn't mean everyone else can afford 10% of their costs. Some people may only be able to afford 5%. Some people can afford the full 100% of their costs. We have to think about equity in terms of finances and affordabilities. So as we continue to think about population growth, this is what I mentioned with populations, the global population growing at an average of 1% every single year, which comes out to be that 81 million number, and that's including births and deaths, but we still have more births than deaths, primarily because people are living longer. Not a bad thing at all. It's just something we have to consider. So when we think about population growth, we also have to think about the demand of individuals who would want to attend higher education institutions. So expansion and massification are on the rise. How many of us have seen new universities advertised in our local or global kind of context? Advertisements on TV, on social media, the internet, of go to University of Phoenix, go to Harvard in India, go to New York University in Abu Dhabi. We have decided that we need to grow and expand. India is a great example of this. India, for the last 25 years, have been going through a process of what they call massification of higher education. So that is the creation of new universities. And when we talk about the creation of new universities, it's not just one at a time. Sometimes it can be as many as 10 to 12 per year, new universities being created. They're not large. Some of them are only 100 students strong. Some of them have a few thousand, but they are catching momentum. With billions of individuals who need education, we have learned that more universities, more learning spaces, more programs are required to educate higher individuals who would like higher education. Now, how does this make it a problem or a challenge in terms of admissions processes? Well, we have to decide who's qualified in terms of how do we understand who wants to go to college and which school should they go to, which school should they be accepted. We also have to think some of these schools are building their systems out. So one university that had 5 campuses originally may now have 6 to 7 campuses, if not 10. So when those campuses kind of emerge, does it increase competition for the main campus? And I heard a little bit about that with the UCR system and the San Jose campus being kind of the central campus. We see it also in the States with what we call our flagship universities. For example, Indiana University Bloomington is our main campus, but we have 8 other campuses in our state that also are part of the system, but they are not the main campus. And when students are thinking about, I think something popped up. There we are. So when we're thinking about population growth and demand and the expansion of those universities and campuses and the needs, we have to stop and think about, are those quality programs, are those quality educations, and how do we begin identifying those to admit students in those programs? What are the requirements? What are the needs? And are the programs going to have, or are the universities and campuses going to have specific programs? I often like to think not every university, not every campus needs to have an arts or a science program. It's starting to talk about, does that university do better in the sciences, and maybe they should focus on that. Should they focus on something that they specialize in instead of trying to provide everything all at once, especially as we start thinking about how do we expand or massify higher education. The other side of that is maybe we do need to offer everything all at once. For individuals, if we're thinking equitably, who may not be able to relocate or move, and they want to pursue English or they want to pursue engineering, should those opportunities be available in their local context without them having to relocate or being excluded because they are unable to relocate? These are all questions that we have to consider as we think about challenges with population growth and demand. In terms of standardized testing, this is something that we all are familiar with in one capacity or another. And wherever we stand in terms of the issues or the situations, I like to first start this section of saying standardized testing, it is efficient. It works to a certain extent. Right now, we may not have better solutions. What we have to start thinking about with standardized testing is how do we innovate or re-identify issues with standardized testing. I never call for the abolishment of standardized testing. I always think about, could it be optional? Could it be just one way to understand how to evaluate a student during the admissions process instead of thinking about one test score? How do we think about their race? How do we think about gender? How do we think about their income levels? How do we think about their high school GPAs? How do we think about all the things that make an individual unique, who makes an individual special, who makes their contributions and ways of knowledge diverse? How do we get that reflected in our application processes and our admissions processes? Oftentimes, we see many universities in many countries, the United States, Germany, Belgium, Brazil. We also see it in India. One test pretty much predicts the rest of that student's life. If they get into college, if they don't get into college. If they do get into college, which college are they actually qualified for? I recently learned about your ranking system here at the University of Costa Rica, but also Costa Rica broadly, talking about how students take the required exams and understanding that there is a vocational exam, but also an admissions exam, and how you all rank your institutions. So even when you're thinking about standardized testing and how you do the application process, some decisions have to be made on the behalf of admissions recruiters, and staff members and administrators when we're thinking about the system of rankings. In America, we have tests. We have moved over to test optional, where students get to decide if they're going to take a test or if they're not going to take a test. And the reason we've done that is because we've realized that our exam practices, as an example, have been racially charged, meaning our exams have been created by individuals who've had privilege over years. So those individuals have written the tests, they have graded the tests, and they have passed judgments on individuals who take the test. Even in the examples on the tests, students who are not of privileged classes experience difficulties on that test because some of the language, some of the examples on those tests are not part of their everyday life. I remember when I was taking my standardized test, it's called the SAT, they gave me an example of John Smith is walking to the store to pick up 30 apples. a box of caviar, and some shoe polish. And then it was a mathematical equation after that. As I was taking the test, I was like, okay, I understand walking to the store. I get that. Apples, I understand. Caviar, what is caviar? Is that something you buy? Is that free? I have no idea what you're talking about. And shoe polish, I never even owned shoes that needed to be polished. They were always sneakers, right? And I would take a paper towel sometimes and wipe them off, or they would just always be dirty. So as I was sitting there taking the test, I didn't know what two of the examples were. And even those examples in that one question meant nothing to me answering the question. It was all about math. It still took away ample time for me to understand what they were asking me, especially when standardized tests are timed. So when you're moving slower through a test or you don't understand a test, all because of cultural perspective and who gets to write the test, or who gets to say what's in the test and what's being measured, that places us as at a disadvantage. So when we're thinking about standardized testing, we have to think about not only who writes it and who grades it, but who gets to provide input on what should actually be measured. Do we care about memorization, or do we care about solving solutions? Do we care about what people know or what people have the capacity to go find out? My favorite response to a question is, I don't know, but I can go find the answer. And I think we need more people like that in the world. With that being said, our tests have to reflect those individuals, and we have to measure who those individuals are. There's this common saying in America, and I've heard it around the nation, our best and brightest are not the A+ students. They're the A- students. They are the B+ students. Your grades matter. Do not get me wrong, they matter, but it's often that little extra encouragement, motivation, what we like to call grit, resilience, that ultimately makes us who we are. That adds on top and far beyond the grades and what we get in terms of standardized testing. So once again, standardized testing, it's not horrible, it's not horrendous, but it has been a challenge, it has been a barrier. We have to think about what those practices are doing currently and how we can help them grow and evolve if we decide to continue using these practices. And the last topic I would like to talk about is college choice. As I look at time here, I want to talk about college choice and reliable information in two components. One, similarly as I've done with the first three examples, I want to kind of give my overall observations and thoughts on college choice, but I would also like to share with you all a recent research project that I conducted at my own university, talking about college choice and how we give students college information. So with this, it's going to be two parts around the world, but also a research project that is more localized to Indiana University, specifically the Bloomington campus. So in terms of college choice, we have many students, as I mentioned, with population growth, also talking about disadvantaged backgrounds. We have students who have many choices to make. Now, when we're talking about making choices, these choices are not light. Sometimes the choice is, do I want to be an English major or engineering major? I don't consider that an easy choice. Sometimes it's passion, sometimes it's career outcomes, sometimes it's how much money we would like to make. Other choices we have to make is, do I want to go into debt for college? If I shared how much money I borrowed to go to college in the United States, some of you would be horrified. You can take guesses. I will not confirm or deny that number, but it is an exorbitant amount of how much college can cost, not only in America, but around the world. Even if it only costs $1,000, if you do not have $1,000 to spare or to contribute, then it becomes unaffordable. So when we're thinking about choices, many students would like to go to the top universities, or they would like to go to their top program, or they would like to have a particular experience. And those are choices we have to make, but they're not made in silos or vacuums. They are made in conjunction with some of the other barriers. So as I think about college choice and reliable information, I always do this one last because it is also predicated on some of those other barriers that I've outlined earlier in this presentation. When it comes to reliable information, getting information out is easy. We can send an email, we can send a text message, there are commercials. That has become easier. But for some reason, students who need the information still aren't receiving the exact or precise information that they require to make their own decisions. Once again, it's talking about equity. Are you receiving the information that you need to make the best decision for you, for your family, for the careers that you would like to have, the type of life you would like to have? That is what's not happening. Individuals, we are in information overload. We get tons of information at our fingertips hourly, daily. I even see some people checking their phones randomly right now. Not mad about it, there's nothing wrong with it, but with how much information is being pushed our way, that's great that it comes so quickly, but is it the right information? Is it the necessary information? And oftentimes it's not. So therefore it leaves us and disadvantaged student populations the responsibility to go figure out what we do not know, talk to individuals that we do not even know exist, to receive the information that we don't even know that is out there. How do we know to ask for a tuition waiver if no one told us that those things existed? How do we know to ask for part-time work if we didn't know that was an opportunity or if that was never messaged to us? How do we know to ask for certain things? And that's something we have to think about. And also, as I said, choices, there are numerous. It's not just one. We make choices. I think the average is, I think we make about 1,000 choices per day in our life. That could be everything from what am I going to eat for breakfast? How am I going to get to work? What time am I going to leave? Am I going to be late? Am I going to sleep a little bit later? We make thousands of choices per day. Now, if you think about how many choices we make for our longer term, it could be very overwhelming. So reliable information must be there so we can be a little bit more efficient with the number of choices we have to make in a given day, especially with major choices when it comes to education. With that being said, in terms of this research project that I would like to share with you all today, I wanted to let you know this work that I'm sharing is in combination with some of my doctoral students who work on my research team. There are 5 of them, incredible doctoral students similar to you all, who are pursuing higher education, who are trying to think about what does it mean to give back to the world, to pursue different types of education and look at different issues. And what we did here at the university, or Indiana University, is that we have a pre-college program, which what we call pre-college programs can vary in the United States, but this one particularly, it takes juniors in high school, so students who are in the 11th grade, from disadvantaged backgrounds, and it welcomes them to the university for a summer. Specifically, they get to spend 2 weeks on a university campus as a junior in high school. And it tries to provide them with all knowledge about admissions, what is college like, what does it mean to apply for college, how do you finance college, how do you find community at college, everything you can think about that you're experiencing in college right now. This program attempts to get students earlier in high school to think about college, but also have those experiences. So when they're making those choices, they are making choices with reliable information. I will admit this is not unique to Indiana University. There are many schools around the nation that have this. New York University has one, University of Houston has one, University of Southern California has one, University of Texas. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of schools that provide this type of service to high school students. And it varies depending on what they believe their local community needs. Indiana University, we selected the 11th grade because we felt that was the best opportunity to catch students for our local communities and contexts. Whereas back in Texas, University of Houston, they start as early as the 8th or 9th grade because they want to make sure students are thinking long-term about their opportunities. Other states and programs will start as late as senior year. So it varies. In this particular program, it starts at the 11th grade. And what we ultimately wanted to understand in terms of this program that has been in existence now for over 10 years, going on more like 12 to 13 years, is what are the college students' perceptions about how this program helped them get into college? Not only get into college, but help them succeed. So when we're thinking about admissions and admissions processes, we're not just saying, are you good enough to be here? We're saying, are you going to succeed here? That is what admissions tends to be about more times than not. It's not so much as how well did you do in the past, but what have you done in the past that we can understand to kind of predict how you are going to be in the future? How will you perform? What will you contribute to the society, to your local community, to our academic classrooms? So when we're thinking about these research questions, we wanted to know, how did this program help students make decisions, but ultimately, how did they feel it reverberated after they were admitted to a university? Okay, And then we also want to know which components of the program. So in a 2-week process, students had over 25 different programs, over 100 different interactions that they experienced in 14 days, which is a lot to experience in the matter of 2 weeks. So we wanted to know which components of these programs help them with applications, but also help them be successful in their academic endeavors. So this is a quick sample of who we reached out to. So the total population of the individuals who've participated in this program over the past decade or so was over 1,000 students. So we sent a call out to all 1,000 students, and eventually we got responses from 100 students who wanted to participate in our study. Now, with that being said, not everyone was able to participate in all the interviews, so our final sample of individuals who could make it to all the interviews and give us full responses to our surveys ended up being 23 individuals. And so for confidentiality, because that's part of our research process, we've numbered them and coded them as participants 1 through 23, and that's how we'll refer to them from here on out. But as you can see, some of the demographics of this particular sample, 2 identified as men, and 21 identified as women. So what we started seeing is that individuals in this particular program tended to be more women than men, which is what we would hope and we are excited about, as we have seen that women are often disadvantaged in the American context with getting into college, even though the numbers will tell you there are more women in college than there are men right now. So it says, well, if that's it, then why are we talking about this? There are more women than men. What we have started unpacking with this is that women have more difficult challenges of getting into college, and the processes that it has taken for them to get through college has been different. So that's why we wanted to make sure that we had women included and somewhat overrepresented and presented in this program, but also make sure we got their perspectives as well as a category that has been historically disenfranchised or excluded from education. Also, racially, we had 16 of them identify as Black, 2 identify as Latina, 2 identify as Middle Eastern, 2 identify as East Asian, 1 identify as white, and 1 identified as biracial. And the 9 of these participants, for those who can't see it in this corner here, identified as first-generation students, meaning that 9 of these students are the first to go to college in their entire family. So what we did in terms of understanding these students is that, once again, we sent out surveys inviting everyone to participate, and then we conducted interviews with students to understand how their experience evolved throughout the process of participating in the program, but then also how do they perceive their trajectories of getting into college from an admission standpoint and then beyond. So how was it in their first year of college? How did they do in their third year of college? 2 of the students, they were of an earlier cohort from around 2012, if I remember the exact year. So they had already graduated college and had moved on to graduate coursework. So we wanted to understand if maybe not, if this program in the 11th grade helped them think about long-term possibilities such as graduate coursework and career outcomes, which turned out to be very interesting as well. And so in this process, we had our interviewers, that's myself and my 5 doctoral students who I mentioned are on the research team. We conducted semi-structured interviews of, asking starting questions, but then probing further. And then we made sure that the interview data was qualitatively coded and compared and categorized throughout the process. And we had multiple coders to do that for us. Now, in terms of findings, we had 5 findings to talk about choice and information. Ultimately, these 5 kind of dimensions turned out to be what happened or what came more to the surface level when we talked about college choice preparation and admission standards. We talked about college manifestation as being the first one. So what does college manifestation mean? It really simply means, do I have the confidence to say, this is what I want and I belong there? Do I have kind of the vision to say, yes, I want to go to college and I see myself not only enrolling but being successful to a certain extent? So talking about, can we envision ourselves in a college space or process? And also talking about, how do we say, if we see ourselves belonging there, are we going to go through the process? So this participant, what we have coded participant number 6, articulated, I won't read the entire blurb, but I will read the highlighted parts, that they found that college was actually attainable after spending 2 weeks in this program, and they previously did not believe that college was attainable. And it also allowed them to not be as scared of the process. So for individuals who may have never been to college, or who have family who've never been to college, who don't know much more about the process, they said that this particular program, in terms of getting admitted or preparing for admissions, allowed them to be less afraid of at least attempting the process and pursuing it with some type of confidence. All right? And then also saying it helped them feel more comfortable. And when we're feeling more comfortable, we tend to do a little bit better on our admissions tests, how we portray ourselves in our admissions essays, and other aspects of the admissions process. The second one is talking about this program and what happens in college admissions processes, the influence of counselor and family influence. So oftentimes our families are the biggest influencers of our decision making, and also the individuals that teach us, that guide us, such as counselors and teachers, are also major influencers. And what came to be is that these counselors and family members not only influence the students' decision to participate in this program, but it also helped them go further to say, hey, you've done this program, you can succeed, you have information, let's go ahead and move on to the application. So when we're talking about admissions processes and issues, we have to start thinking about what role does the family and the counselor or the teachers and advisors play in this process, and how can we harness and utilize them in productive and constructive manners. Now, with this particular participant number 4, they said their counselor told them that they were eligible for something. So they didn't even know they were eligible for the program, and they did not know they were eligible for college, and they just thought it would be a good idea to try. So simply by saying, I didn't know this thing existed, someone told me I was eligible, why not try? Had that counselor or teacher never told them, or family member told them that they were eligible to apply, they probably would not have even attempted or tried to apply to the program or to apply to college. As I mentioned, this program allows students in their 11th or junior year of high school to come onto a college campus, even though they're not college students. And what students said is that once they made it to that environment, they were able to navigate college campuses more efficiently. Most people ask, so why does that matter? If you go to a place and you're like, I can manage this, I can navigate it, you're more likely to say, I belong there, I can apply there, I can succeed there. So when we talk about early introduction and talking about admissions, we have to think about how do we help students envision themselves here, which we have done it in many ways. Virtual visits, virtual maps, virtual pictures on websites. Sometimes campus tours happen ahead of schedule in preparation for applying or even in preparation for enrolling. So we have to think about how this program can get students onto campuses in a lived experience for prolonged exposure to help them make a better decision about what they want to study, but also where they would like to study. Participant 5 says, I think just even being able to go down there, meaning coming to campus, and actually live there for a week, experience what it was like being in the dorms, which is our residence halls, where students live on campus for anywhere from 1 to 4 or even sometimes 5 years. And they had an internal reflection that says, wow, this is something that I really could do. So once again, being on campus helped them envision themselves there, but also said they could navigate campus in a more efficient way and made them more comfortable. Professional development. I often like to think of professional development as those codes or rules or regulations that sometimes they tell us about, other times they do not. So how to dress, how to speak to individuals, how to address individuals, how to act, how to behave, how to navigate spaces. Even if, as I was preparing for my trip to Costa Rica, I was thinking, what should I pack? What should I wear? What is going to be considered appropriate? What's going to be considered disrespectful? And honestly, I still have a little anxiety about not wearing a tie right now, right? These are all things that go along with professional development of how can we be, some of the unwritten rules. And I like to focus on the unwritten rules because many disadvantaged students don't have access to those unwritten rules. We give them guidelines, we give them checklists, we give them bullet points to say this is what you should do. It could be a list of 10, But we then know there are probably 30 or 40 other things that we have to abide by, or things that we should know that many disadvantaged students do not. So when we're talking about admissions, we have to think about what are those unwritten rules of professional development? How do we speak? How do we write appropriately? How much information do we share in the admissions process? Do we share only what's asked, or do we share a little bit more? Sometimes oversharing can feel very uncomfortable for the admissions process, especially for those who are reviewing. And sometimes not sharing enough can seem like you're hiding something. So in the professional development process, we have to stop and think about how students are thinking about admissions, but also how are they thinking about their lives and careers beyond? Because the same kind of rules that they are doing with admissions will also be applied to their career trajectories on campus and after they graduate. So participant number 2 said, it made me understand the kind of values and properties that I have and that I can use to better myself. So when we're talking about morals, values, not all those things are often expressed or written down for us. And the last finding of this particular study is talking about building accessible social networks. So I have highlighted that information is important, family is important, teachers, counselors, they're important. But what we also have to stop and think about as we're thinking about college admissions, but also how we thrive on college campuses, are the communities and social networks students tend to find and develop. How many people in this room picked their college, this one, based off where other individuals in your high school may have decided or talked about? Is that the case here? I'll give you an example. I got a little mixed up on that. So for example, when I was in high school and I was thinking about going to college, I sat with all my friends and we looked at each other and we said, are you going to college? Are you going to college? Yeah, and after we said, I think we all decided we're going to college, then became the question, well, which college are you thinking about going to? Are you going to go to the big university in Austin? Are you going to go to the big university in San Antonio? I don't know where I want to go. Where are you going? And then from there, we started deciding, well, you're going there, maybe I'll look at it too, right? So peer influence and building social networks is a very big part of how we make sense of the world, but also how we make some of those decisions. And once we make it to those college campuses, we then have to think about who are the social networks that are going to be with us on those college campuses, even after we enroll. Who do I study with? Who do I laugh with? Who do I eat with? On those days when things are stressful and life are intervening, who do I cry with? Who do I lean upon? Who do I ask for help? Who do I ask to help celebrate things, right? So developing social networks is a huge part of identifying how we think about admissions. And people often ask, what does that have to do with the admissions process? We often have to think about, if we're going to enroll a student, who are they going to find on this campus? Are they the only person that has a particular identity? And not only have an identity, but an identity that is important to them. And how do we understand that? If being a woman is a salient identity, as we call it, an important identity, and that is what is at the forefront of our concerns around health, happiness, well-being, safety, then we need to make sure that women have other women on campus that they can find community and social networks with. Same thing with race, same thing with sexuality, same things with income. We have to make sure that people have social networks that they can tap into while they're in college. So I know this has been a lot, and as I wrap up, I like to think about in my closing statement, and I promise this is the last slide as I wrap my time up here. I always like to leave a little bit of information on what I think we can do to move forward. So wherever you are and whatever type of work you're doing in this world, I always like to think about there are issues of policy that you can address. If you're not into policy, a lot of people are not, there are ways of practice we can think about. If you're not in a place to do a practice or to influence practice, there's also research that we can think about. There are also other ways, but in the interest of time, I like to kind of narrow it down to these three. So in the policy realm, we have to think about what are the policies around testing? What are the policies around eligibility? What are the policies around who can pay or how much they can pay? All those policies that are in place around the world, although they are varying, we have to identify which policies need to be revamped, which need to be abolished, and which new policies need to be created, especially when we think about financial aid and eligibility, right? And they must be informed not only by the research, but they have to be informed by the nuances. So not just gender, not only income, but what happens when you have potentially a woman who is low income in a rural area in the United States? What does this policy do for her, or what doesn't it do for her? Is it positive, or is it a negative impact on her life, her well-being, happiness, and success? And so when I'm talking about nuances, it's something that we like to call intersectionality of identities, is understanding who we are as individuals and making sure the policies reflect all those nuances and intersectionalities as much as possible. In practice, when we're thinking about admissions processes, we have to think about how do we streamline the services and support? So how easy is it to find the applications? Who can we call if we have questions for applications? How do we streamline this process of they have submitted an application and they're now receiving feedback on a component is missing? Throughout the world, we know that applications are multi-component. There's usually a student portion, there's a testing portion, there are essays, there could be letters of recommendations. And how do we streamline our processes to make it easier for students to understand, one, what's required, but two, if all those components have successfully made it into the tracking systems to have a complete application, and to know that their application is being reviewed with just as much dignity and respect as the next applicant in the lineup, even though there may be thousands, if not millions, of applicants in a particular pool during an admission cycle. Specifically for institutions, we need to put more energy on the students that we have from our local communities than the students that we want. I always say this for very elite institutions around the world. Those are the Harvards, the Stanfords, those are the University of Germany. There are many universities out there. Not to call them out or not to shame them, we, in our efforts to globalize and be more internationalized, we have left behind our local communities that have helped support us and build us up. So how do we make sure that we are still globalizing and internationalizing while also supporting individuals that have grown up around our universities and campuses? How do we call them in? How do we admit them? How do we make sure that we are still enrolling them and not excluding them just to allow other students from far away places to enroll in our campuses? We have to think strategically about how we make space for both. And then in terms of research, as we round out here, is saying that research is needed. Oftentimes, research focuses on the larger populations because that's who we have more access to. We have to start identifying those smaller populations. These are individuals who may come from small villages, small tribal councils, small rural areas that may only have one high school, or maybe they have one school for all students. They don't even have multiple schools. It's just one school for everyone. Right? We have to figure out, how do we do research on them? How do we understand their needs? How do we start providing resources and services to help them get into college and be successful in college? And then we also have to think about research as a pipeline approach. We often study education as early childhood, maybe high school. I focus on higher education. We have to think about, what does early childhood say about higher education? How can students be started on a path to success as early as pre-kindergarten, the first grade, fourth grade, all the way through the 12th grade? These are not separated experiences. In fact, we say you have to pass the first grade to get to the second grade to get to the third grade. It is almost unfathomable that you would make it to the sixth grade without going through grades 1 through 5, or the majority of those, right? So if we're saying it is predicated on you moving through a process, then we must research the process in its entirety. We can no longer just focus on small vignettes of the process solely. We still have to do that type of research, but we can no longer only rely on that research, because it is a lifelong process, right? When we reflect on our lives, whether you're 17, whether you're 30, whether you're 60, whether you're 90, we don't stop and think of it as chapters. We acknowledge the chapters, but we think of it as a life lived. Education must also do the same, of saying these individuals who are going through our processes and systems, they have lived experiences throughout the entire education pipeline. Let's research it as such. With that being said, I would like to thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience. I would love to take any questions for curiosity or clarification if there are any. Thank you all. Am I supposed to press it?
Buenos días. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting facts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Agradecí por la presentación y también me llamó mucho la atención el estudio que hicieron y también cómo la Universidad de Indiana y otras tienen esos proyectos de ir invitando a la población desde secundaria para que sean interesados en. So it was interesting, the process that you have, well, in other universities to, let's say, guide students or invite them, feel them that they can go to college. That's really, really interesting. Well, every one of us has stories. Every one of us has experiences. I don't know if he was willing to take questions. Si alguno tiene alguna duda o experiencias que quieran a partir de lo que él estaba narrando.
Thank you, Dr. Shirley. There was a quote and said, institutions must focus more energy on students they have and less energy on students they want. So it made me ask, what is education? Formal education in regards of equality. No, equity. Yes. Equity. Are higher education systems then prepared for new generations to provide students not only information or knowledge, but also to develop skills, competences, to contribute to societies?
Absolutely. So I think asking what is the purpose of education is where we always have to start when we're thinking about equity. And I do believe, and this is where we as scholars, we start to debate about what the purpose of education is. But in my professional and personal experience, I believe that college is meant to, one, help people raise themselves up into a different mobile standing if that's what they wish to do, but then also provide students with the skills and the resources to embark on different ways to contribute to their economies and their societies, and also their families. So when we're thinking about the students that we have versus the students that we want, how do we understand who sits around us? Who do we have access to in our immediacy, instead of sitting in offices and saying, oh, I really wish I had a student who got all A's in chemistry, right? How do we find a student who's interested in chemistry already, who may be doing all right in chemistry? And how do we as educators kind of not only educate them, but transform them, mentor them to be one of those individuals who can do the same thing as the student who got all A's in chemistry? So I believe education is meant to provide them with skills, also give them information that they don't have, but really understanding who they are and where they're starting from and understanding their potential. Many students, and I would even say maybe some geniuses that we will never know, have been left behind only because we've dreamt about the perfect student, or we've dreamt about the ideal social contributor, when we've had individuals who can do the exact same things in different manners right at our fingertips, but we just did not stop to recognize it. And that is a detriment to them and a detriment to society. Yep. Thank you.
Any other question?
Well, thank you, Maurice. I think it was just really a different thing of what we're used to listening to. Normally, research is on other things, and this is really wonderful. So I'm saying that this is really wonderful because we can all identify, at least us as teachers, as coming, being the first generation, the first person in the family who went to college, and we could share stories later on, maybe if we have lunch. But what I wanted to say is that it's more of a comment, and then I suppose you could compliment, is that unfortunately, at least from the experience in Costa Rica, we're caught up in doing what we do, which is a lot of paperwork and a lot of teaching and a lot of other things, and we really forget what we're supposed to be doing, I think. And I'm not saying me, Lucy, but saying the university itself. So we are not, I don't think we're doing enough as a university and also as a country and as a society to really provide opportunities for all of those who have that talent that you were talking about. We know, we were just talking about this before, not because we weren't paying attention, but because we thought it was so interesting and we got carried away. You know, how many students out there don't even make it to go to, you know, to take the admissions test because they don't have anyone to tell them to do it, because they don't even think that they could do it. So why even waste my time going to do it? Because I don't think I'm capable of doing it. And also, we were saying that unfortunately what's happening in Costa Rica is the UCR is the most prestigious university, and we're very proud to be teachers here, but what's happening is that it's becoming an elite type of university, so that those who can afford a process of preparing themselves for the admissions test have an advantage. And the great majority, those whom belong to so-called minority groups, you know, Afro-Costa Ricans, indigenous populations of the people that live in the countryside, they don't really have that help. I don't think we're really working hard enough to provide them with that support that they need to even consider going to college. So college is really becoming a privilege, and those whose parents can afford paying a private tutor to prepare them to score high in the admissions tests are making it to college, to public colleges. And then unfortunately, those who really could have more of a contribution, who could really do more, and whom we should be devoted to, are left behind. So I'm really grateful that you're pointing that out, because sometimes, and I'm going to say this for everyone who's here, is that I studied in the United States for a while, and I've lived the experience there as well, but we have this false idea that in the United States, everyone who can go to college, that everyone is rich, that there's no such thing as first generation students who are going to college. So I'm glad that you really helped, and I hope that this is clear, that you know that it happens everywhere, and that as colleges we really have that, you know, that responsibility to do more. So it was just more of a comment, and if you'd like to compliment, and thank you, because I think everything that you said was just really, really relevant and really nice. Nicely put.
Yes. Well, thank you for that comment, and also thank you for the insights. Before you started, you said, you know, it's different in Costa Rica. Had you not said that and then went on with the example, I'd be like, that's America, that's Brazil, right? And not saying that Costa Rica isn't original or unique, but as you mentioned, this is happening all around the world. So individuals with tutoring, right, that happens in the United States. I know students in the United States who will pay almost $10,000 American dollars just for tutors to get ready for an entrance exam. Our entrance exams also can range anywhere from $65 to $150, and they will take the exam over and over and over again and pay the fee to do that. Our entrance exams, we also have to pay to send those. So after you pay the $100 to take the test, you get to send it to 4 schools. Most of our students will apply to 15 or 20 schools. Anything above that 4, you have to spend another $20 for every school that you send your exam score to. So there's a lot of cost, there's a lot of affordability issues once you even get there. So as you were talking about the elite schools, Indiana University is a public school. What that means in the United States is that individuals in the state of Indiana should have access to it. But we have now become an elite institution on a global scale to the point that those individuals in Indiana don't have as much access, even though that they pay taxes into the system, even though that they have lived there all their lives, right? They are competing with individuals around the world. Not a bad thing, but some of them are being pushed out or excluded from their own institution that is meant to serve their community and their state. And so we have issues with prestige in the United States. And as you mentioned, I've seen this in Brazil with their admissions exam called the vestibular. Once again, thousands upon thousands of reales being paid for tutors, coaching, all those things, right? Even in some Western countries, it's people get access to old tests, to take the old test in preparation for the new tests, right? It is a very big process to say, I can go and I am comfortable with even taking the test, but once you get there, you need so much support, so many resources. And this is not meant to discourage you, be like, oh, this is a depressing talk. It's meant to say, these are the realities. How do we remove those? And my last comment about being a little overwhelmed. You have a lot of paperwork. Absolutely. On one of the slides, I did mention bureaucratic processes, which means heavy administration processes. I have been swamped in paperwork. Even as a faculty member, I've been swamped in paperwork to the point that I didn't even prepare for class some days because I was so caught up in checking reports and checking forms and making sure I got my classroom inputted and making sure that I had, even from this trip, I'm scared about how many of the receipts I have to submit to get reimbursed for travel. There are so many papers and so many processes that often take up all of our time and energy to the point we can't do some of the work I highlighted. My goal here is to say, how can we remove some of those things from our plates? I think we have boxed ourselves into structures and systems that stop us from doing what we originally wanted to do. And that's why when Dr. Milagros was saying, what's the point of education? I think we have to stop and ask ourselves, what are we doing here? Are we here just to check boxes and stamp more paperwork? Or are we meant to actually go out to those schools and talk to families, talk to students? Are we meant to have programs? Are we meant to teach? Are we meant to be more of social activists? How do we get back to that instead of worried about financial? Don't get me wrong, we have to keep track of our money. we have to do some of those processes. But how do we dial back on some of the things that we don't need to do? I often challenge people, because I've done it with my own job, is what happens if I do not submit that piece of paper? I'm not going to submit it and find out. And 10 years later, no one has ever followed up on it. So I have identified that as a process or a paper that needs not be filled out, and I've reported that to my institution. And we've removed it. So we have to identify what can be left undone instead of just doing it for the sake of doing it. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Do we have any more participations?
It's only their second week
Okay.
Ah,
No, but
okay. How is the second week going for us then?
I think they are saving their words for the second part of the session.
That is
So
understandable.
maybe I'll share my story, and then that will be the bridge to the second part. Now, the second part of this activity was Professor Shirley wanted to have a conversation straight with students, like an exchange. He wants to know about your experience, how you entered the university, in which conditions, how supported you feel from the university. So maybe I'm going to share my experience, which is outdated because it was like eons ago, but maybe that will open the... Okay, I was one of those who raised their hand at the beginning of the presentation. In my case, I was the first person in my family who had access to the university, and I didn't know how important it was to access, to have this kind of studies. In that moment, I didn't know what Universidad de Costa Rica was. I didn't know what UNA or TEC was, because there weren't many private universities in that time either. And it was the senior year in high school, and my father was fired. So my mom had to look for a job. I had to work also. It was hard, but at the end, I am here. So I went to the talks from the universities. I couldn't go to Feria Vocacional. I couldn't afford it. I took the exam. I passed, and here I am. So I was one of you at some point, and you can be even bigger than I am, much bigger, when you finish. So.
So, I mean, I don't have a comment. When people share their stories, I always just say, one, thank you for being vulnerable enough to share your experience with us, but then also, two, thanks for letting us learn from you. Thank you.
¿Alguien quiere compartir su historia de universidad?